I hope this finds you well. In every episode I've seen of the first 48, it seems like the suspect usually ends up confessing in some way, and there's never an attorney in the room with them. Yet I have never heard the detectives say you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can be used against you in court, or you have the right to counsel and the right to have counsel appointed. Over the last 50 years, these rights have been known as Miranda Warnings. Credit goes to the first 48. Whenever a suspect says that they don't want to talk anymore, the detectives immediately stop the interrogation. This procedure is in perfect step with today's case, Miranda versus Arizona. The case was decided in 1966, making this year the 50th anniversary of the case. The vote was 5-4 in favor of Miranda, and it is why the police say what they say when you get pinched. Now, if we could just get police to remind you that you have the right to refuse a search, all would be right in the world. Side note, there's a long line of cases dealing with the particulars of police interrogation and Miranda warnings that we will discuss in later episodes, so make sure you subscribe. Let's dig into the case. The question before the court was whether the government can use statements obtained from a suspect when the suspect was not informed of his or her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination before they were interrogated. Said differently, does the police practice of interrogating individuals without notifying them of their right to counsel and their protection against self-incrimination violate the Fifth Amendment? So here's what happened. Miranda was actually 4 cases consolidated into one. Ernesto Miranda was suspected of kidnapping and rape, yet the police only had circumstantial evidence against him. He was turned into police by his girlfriend and ultimately signed a confession. He was falsely told during that interview process that he was identified in a lineup, and he was not notified of his rights during that interview as well. Michael Viñera was arrested for robbery. Viñera orally admitted to the robbery to the first officer that arrested him, and he was held in detention for 8 hours before he made a full admission to a district attorney. Carl Westover was arrested for 2 robberies. Westover was questioned over 14 hours by local police and then handed over to the FBI. The FBI agents were able to get Westover to actually sign a confession. Finally, Roy Stewart was arrested along with members of his family, and it took 9 interrogations over 5 days before Stewart would confess. In none of these cases were suspects given full warnings of their rights at the outset of their interrogations. All the confessions were admitted at their trials, and all defendants were convicted. Miranda, the case's namesake, was sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. Here's how we get to the Supreme Court. The defendants all appealed to higher courts, and their respective convictions were affirmed with exception of Stewart. Stewart's conviction was reversed by the California Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court granted certiorari and combined the cases to resolve the confusion among those lower courts relating to a Supreme Court ruling 2 years prior to Miranda called Escobedo versus Illinois. But Escobedo didn't fully outline what was required, hence the reason for the confusion among the different courts. Chief Justice Warren authored the opinion, alluding to a line of cases in which the court progressively dealt with improper interrogation tactics. Chief Justice Warren stated, "The blood of the accused is not the only hallmark of an unconstitutional inquisition." He went on to state that the government needs to notify arrested individuals of their Fifth Amendment constitutional rights, specifically their right to remain silent, an explanation that anything they say could be used against them in court, their right to have counsel, and their right to have counsel appointed to represent them if necessary. Without these notifications, anything admitted to by a suspect in an interrogation will be inadmissible in court. Now, the defendant may waive these rights, provided the waiver is made voluntarily, knowingly, and intelligently. If, however, the individual indicates in any manner at any stage of that interrogation or process that he or she wishes to consult with an attorney before speaking, then there can be no questioning. Likewise, if the individual is alone and indicates in any manner that he or she does not wish to be interrogated, the police cannot question the individual. But wait, there's more. Just because the suspect or defendant may have answered some questions or volunteered some information on his or her own does not deprive them of that right to refrain from answering any further questions until they have an attorney. Basically, once an individual chooses to remain silent or asks to first see an attorney, an interrogation should cease. Furthermore, the individual has the right to stop the interrogation at any moment. So ultimately, the court ruled prosecutors may not use statements from interrogations unless they can show that procedural safeguards were used to protect the privilege against self-incrimination. Justice Harlan, Justice White, and Justice Clark all wrote dissents in this case. Justice Harlan argued that the Fifth Amendment rule against self-incrimination was never intended to forbid any and all pressures against self-incrimination. Justice White argued that the court broadened the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to include these Miranda warnings by ruling the way that they did. And finally, Justice Clark argued that the court was making a new rule, similar to what Justice White was saying. Of course, the case had a huge impact on the criminal justice system. Miranda was retried for rape and kidnapping without his confession used as evidence, and again he was still sentenced to 20 to 30 years. He was released 5 years later on parole and became sort of a local celebrity. He autographed and sold the Miranda cards that the police were using to verify that they had provided proper warnings to suspects. And he continued to have run-ins with the law. Of course, not as large as the crimes he was convicted of, but he still couldn't keep his act together. Ultimately, Miranda was stabbed and killed 10 years after the Supreme Court ruling. A man named Ezekiel Marino was suspected of the stabbing, but was never brought to justice. Thanks for watching.